Sarah Martinez had always been different from other soldiers. At 28, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but her reputation in the Army Rangers was legendary. While other recruits struggled with basic training, Sarah seemed to move through obstacles like water flowing around rocks. Her instructors called it natural instinct. Her fellow Rangers called it magic. The helicopter flew through the dark Afghan mountains, its rotors cutting through the thin air at 8,000 feet. Sarah sat quietly among her team, checking her equipment for the third time. The mission was supposed to be routine: extract a captured intelligence officer from a Taliban compound in the valley below. But something felt wrong. Captain Williams, their team leader, had been acting strange all week. He avoided eye contact with Sarah and whispered conversations with the pilot that stopped whenever she approached. The other 4 team members seemed nervous too, glancing at her when they thought she wasn't looking. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of her parachute pack. She had packed it herself that morning, following the same ritual she'd performed hundreds of times before. Every strap, every cord, every buckle was exactly where it should be. Her survival training had taught her to trust her equipment, but more importantly, to trust her instincts. The helicopter suddenly banked hard to the left, throwing everyone against the side wall. Through the small window, Sarah could see the rocky terrain below, jagged peaks that looked like broken teeth in the moonlight. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing they were approaching the drop zone. Captain Williams stood up, his face hard and unreadable in the red cabin light. He moved toward Sarah with purpose, and she noticed his hand resting on his sidearm. The other team members had gone completely silent, their eyes fixed on the floor. "Martinez," Williams said, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "There's been a change of plans." Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but her expression remained calm. Years of training had taught her to control her reactions, to think clearly even when danger was approaching. She stood up slowly, keeping her hands visible and her movements non-threatening. "What kind of change, sir?" she asked. Williams didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for something in his tactical vest. When his hand emerged, it held a small recording device. He pressed play, and Sarah's own voice filled the cabin, speaking in Pashto to an unknown contact. The words were about troop movements, patrol schedules, and mission details. "We know you've been feeding information to the enemy," Williams said coldly. "How long have you been working for them?" Sarah's mind raced. The recording was her voice, but she had never spoken those words. Someone had used voice synthesis technology to create fake evidence against her. But who? And why? "That's not me," she said firmly. "Someone doctored that recording." Williams shook his head. "We have other evidence too. Money transfers to your account from known terrorist financiers. Encrypted messages on your personal phone. It's over, Martinez." The helicopter suddenly lurched, and the pilot announced they were having mechanical problems. The engine made strange whining sounds, and the aircraft began to lose altitude rapidly. Through the chaos, Sarah realized this wasn't an accident, this was planned. "You're going to jump without proper equipment," Williams shouted over the increasing noise. "Make it look like an accident. If you survive the fall, the Taliban will find you soon enough." 2 of the other Rangers moved toward her, but Sarah was already in motion. She had spent years training for exactly this kind of situation, though she never imagined it would be her own team trying to eliminate her. Her hand shot out, striking the first Ranger in the throat and dropping him instantly. The second Ranger tried to grab her, but Sarah spun away from his grasp and delivered a precise kick to his knee. He went down hard, screaming in pain. The remaining 2 Rangers hesitated, suddenly unsure of their ability to handle her. Williams drew his pistol, but the helicopter chose that moment to hit severe turbulence. Everyone was thrown around the cabin like dice in a cup. Sarah used the confusion to her advantage, grabbing Williams's gun hand and twisting until he dropped the weapon. "The door!" Williams screamed to the pilot. "Open the cargo door!" The side door of the helicopter suddenly slid open, and the cabin filled with rushing wind. The temperature dropped instantly and the noise became deafening. Sarah could see the ground far below, a patchwork of rocks and shadows that meant certain death for anyone who fell. Williams lunged at her again, this time trying to push her toward the open door. Sarah planted her feet and threw him over her shoulder using his own momentum against him. He crashed into the opposite wall, dazed but still conscious. "You won't get away with this," he snarled. "Even if you survive, you're marked. There's nowhere you can run." Sarah looked at her team leader, a man she had served with for 3 years, and realized she had never really known him at all. "Who's paying you?" she demanded. Before Williams could answer, the pilot announced they were going down. The engine had finally failed completely, and they were in an uncontrolled descent toward the mountain peaks. In the chaos of the emergency, Sarah saw her chance. She grabbed her gear and moved toward the open door. The ground was rushing up to meet them, but she calculated they still had maybe 2 minutes before impact. 2 minutes to figure out how to survive a fall that should kill her. "Going somewhere?" Williams had recovered and was pointing his backup weapon at her. Sarah smiled grimly. "Yes," she said simply, "somewhere you can't follow." Before anyone could react, she dove through the open door and disappeared into the darkness below. Behind her, she could hear Williams screaming orders to the pilot, but the words were lost in the wind. As she fell through the cold mountain air, Sarah reached for her parachute cord and pulled. Nothing happened. She tried again, pulling harder. Still nothing. They had sabotaged her parachute just as she had suspected they might. The ground was getting closer by the second, and Sarah's mind shifted into pure survival mode. She had trained for water landings, forest landings, even urban landings. But she had never trained for surviving a fall from a helicopter without a parachute into rocky terrain. Then she remembered something her grandfather had told her years ago, back when she was just a child learning to climb the cliffs near their reservation. "The mountain doesn't want to hurt you," he had said. "It just wants to test if you're strong enough to belong here." Sarah spread her arms and legs to slow her descent, using her body like a parachute. It wouldn't be enough to save her, but it might buy her a few extra seconds to find something, anything, that could break her fall. Sarah fell through the darkness, her trained eyes scanning the terrain below for anything that might save her life. The moonlight revealed a landscape of sharp rocks and deep crevices, but there, about 50 feet to her left, she spotted something that made her heart leap with hope. A thick grove of pine trees clung to the mountainside, their branches heavy with snow from the recent winter storms. The trees were tall and dense, forming a natural cushion that might absorb enough impact to keep her alive. Sarah angled her body like a skydiver, using the air resistance to guide her fall toward the forest. The wind howled past her ears as she plummeted toward the treetops. At the last second, she crossed her arms over her chest and tucked her chin down, preparing for impact. The first branch hit her like a baseball bat, spinning her sideways. Then another branch caught her shoulder, and another slammed into her ribs. She crashed through the pine canopy like a stone through glass, each branch breaking her fall, but also battering her body. Snow exploded around her as she tumbled from branch to branch, the world spinning in a blur of green needles and white powder. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she hit the ground with a solid thump that knocked the wind from her lungs. Sarah lay motionless in the snow for several minutes, taking inventory of her injuries. Her left shoulder felt like it was on fire, probably dislocated. Her ribs ached with each breath, suggesting at least one was cracked. Blood trickled from dozens of cuts on her face and hands from the pine needles, but she was alive. Above her, she could hear the helicopter's engine sputtering as it struggled to stay airborne. The sound was getting fainter, which meant the pilot was either regaining control or they were crashing somewhere else on the mountain. Either way, she needed to move before Williams organized a search party. Sarah forced herself to sit up, biting back a groan as pain shot through her shoulder. She reached across her body and grabbed her injured arm, then twisted hard and fast. The shoulder popped back into place with a wet sound that made her stomach turn, but the relief was immediate. Getting to her feet took longer than she wanted. Her left leg was weak, probably from a twisted knee, but it would hold her weight. She checked her equipment and was surprised to find most of it had survived the fall. Her combat knife was still in its sheath, her GPS unit was cracked but functional, and her emergency radio was intact. The radio crackled to life when she turned it on, but instead of the normal military channels, she heard voices speaking in Pashto. Taliban fighters were coordinating search patterns across the mountain, looking for the American spy woman who had escaped from the helicopter. Williams had wasted no time calling in his contacts. Sarah switched off the radio and considered her options. She was deep in enemy territory, injured and being hunted by both the Taliban and her own corrupt team members. Her official mission was blown, her reputation was destroyed, and she had no way to contact friendly forces without revealing her location. But Sarah Martinez had not survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by giving up when things got difficult. She pulled out her GPS unit and studied the terrain map. According to the display, she was about 15 miles from the nearest American outpost, but the route would take her through several Taliban-controlled villages. There was another option, though. About 8 miles to the north was an old smuggling route that her grandfather had told her about. During the Soviet invasion, Mujahideen fighters had used hidden caves and mountain passes to move supplies and people across the border. If those routes still existed, they might provide a way to reach safety without being detected. Sarah began walking north, moving carefully through the snow-covered forest. Every step sent pain shooting through her injured ribs, but she maintained a steady pace. Behind her, she could hear vehicles on the mountain roads. Williams and his Taliban allies were already organizing ground teams to search for her body. As she walked, Sarah tried to piece together what had happened. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to frame her as a traitor, using sophisticated technology to fake her voice and plant false evidence. This wasn't the work of a single corrupt officer. This was an organized conspiracy that went much higher up the chain of command. The question was why. Sarah had never handled classified intelligence that would be valuable to enemy forces. She was a ranger, not a spy. Her missions involved direct action and combat, not gathering secrets. What could she have done to make someone want her dead? Then she remembered the mission from 2 weeks earlier. Her team had raided a compound near the Pakistani border and recovered a laptop computer from a Taliban commander. The intelligence officers had been very excited about the data on that computer, but they had classified it at the highest levels. Sarah had never learned what they found. Could that mission be connected to her current situation? Had she seen something during the raid that made her a liability? Sarah thought back to that night, trying to remember every detail. The compound had been larger than expected, with multiple buildings and underground tunnels. They had found the Taliban commander in a hidden room beneath the main house, along with several other men in expensive suits who didn't look like local fighters. One of those men had been talking on a satellite phone when Sarah's team breached the door. He had looked directly at her before Williams ordered her to secure the perimeter outside. She had only seen his face for a few seconds, but something about him had seemed familiar. A branch snapped somewhere behind her, and Sarah immediately dropped to the ground. She lay perfectly still in the snow, listening for any sound that didn't belong to the natural mountain environment. After a few minutes, she heard voices speaking in English. American voices. "The blood trail leads this way," someone said. "She's hurt bad, but she's still moving." "How the hell did she survive that fall?" Another voice replied. "William said she went out without a chute." "Doesn't matter. We find her, we finish the job, and we collect our money. Simple as that." Sarah recognized the voices. They belonged to contractors she had worked with before. Mercenaries who took on jobs that regular military couldn't handle officially. Now she understood the scope of the conspiracy against her. This wasn't just about eliminating a witness. This was about covering up something much bigger. She crawled behind a large boulder and waited for the search team to pass. There were 4 of them, moving in a tactical formation with night vision equipment and automatic weapons. They were professionals, which made them dangerous, but it also meant they would follow predictable patterns. After they disappeared into the forest, Sarah continued north. The snow was getting deeper as she climbed higher into the mountains, and the temperature was dropping. She needed to find shelter soon, or hypothermia would kill her before her enemies got the chance. The old smuggling route her grandfather had described was supposed to be marked by 3 large stones arranged in a triangle. In the darkness, every rock formation looked the same, but Sarah trusted her instincts. She had inherited her grandfather's ability to read the land, to sense the paths that others had walked before her. Finally, after 2 hours of climbing, she found the marker stones. They were partially hidden by snow and vegetation, but the triangle formation was unmistakable. Between the stones was a narrow gap in the rock face that looked like nothing more than a shadow. Sarah squeezed through the opening and found herself in a tunnel that had been carved from the living rock. The air inside was warmer than outside, and she could hear the faint sound of running water somewhere in the darkness. She pulled out a small flashlight and followed the tunnel deeper into the mountain. The passage opened into a larger chamber that had clearly been used as a shelter for many years. There were sleeping areas carved into the walls, fire pits with ancient ashes, and storage niches that still contained old supplies. Most importantly, there was a natural spring that provided fresh water. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she settled into one of the sleeping alcoves. Her grandfather's stories had been true. The mountain was protecting her, just as it had protected the Mujahideen fighters decades earlier. Now she just had to figure out how to use this sanctuary to strike back at the people who had betrayed her. Sarah spent the night in the hidden cave, treating her wounds and planning her next move. The ancient shelter provided everything she needed to survive: fresh water from the underground spring, dried food left by previous travelers, and most importantly, complete concealment from her hunters. As dawn broke outside, Sarah examined the supplies more carefully. Someone had been maintaining this hideout recently. The food was not decades old as she had first thought, but rather months old. There were modern medical supplies hidden behind the old Soviet-era ammunition boxes, and a cache of civilian clothes that would help her blend in with the local population. Most interesting of all was a journal written in multiple languages: English, Pashto, Dari, and Russian. As Sarah read through the entries, she realized this cave was being used by someone running their own intelligence operation. The journal contained detailed information about troop movements, supply routes, and the names of corrupt officials on both sides of the conflict. One name in the journal made her blood run cold: Captain Williams. According to the entries, Williams had been selling weapons to Taliban commanders for over 2 years, using his position to coordinate fake raids that allowed insurgents to escape with American equipment. The journal writer had been tracking Williams and building a case against him. Sarah flipped to the most recent entry, dated just 1 week earlier. The unknown intelligence agent had discovered that Williams was planning to eliminate a witness who had seen too much during a recent mission. The witness was described as a female ranger with exceptional survival skills who might remember the faces from the compound raid. The journal's author had signed each entry with only the initials, AK, and had left instructions for anyone who found the hideout. If something happened to them, the evidence against Williams and his network should be taken to a specific address in Kabul, a safe house run by honest CIA operatives who were investigating corruption in the military. Sarah tore out the relevant pages from the journal and stuffed them into her gear. She now had proof that she was innocent and that Williams was the real traitor. But getting that evidence to the right people would require her to travel hundreds of miles through hostile territory while being hunted by both sides. She changed into the civilian clothes. From the cache, traditional Afghan dress that would help her blend in with local women. The clothing was the right size, suggesting that AK was a woman roughly her build. Sarah wondered if this mysterious agent was still alive or if Williams had already silenced her too. Before leaving the cave, Sarah rigged a simple alarm system using tripwires and empty cans. If anyone found the hideout after her, she would know whether to trust the place when she returned. She also left her own message in the journal, just in case AK was still alive and came back. The tunnel system was more extensive than she had initially realized. Multiple passages led in different directions, and Sarah spent an hour exploring them before finding an exit that emerged in a small valley on the north side of the mountain. The opening was completely hidden by brush and rocks, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Sarah emerged into bright sunlight and immediately spotted smoke rising from a village about 2 miles away. According to her map, this was Kel Malik, a small farming community that was nominally under government control, but probably had Taliban sympathizers among the population. She needed to get closer to the village to gather intelligence, but approaching as an American soldier would be suicide. Dressed in local clothing and with her face partially covered, she might be able to pass as a refugee or traveling trader if she was careful. The walk to the village gave Sarah time to observe the local patterns of life. Farmers were working in terraced fields carved into the mountainside. Women were carrying water from a central well, and children were playing in the dusty streets. It looked peaceful. But Sarah's trained eyes noticed details that revealed the truth. There were no young men visible anywhere in the village. The farmers were all elderly, and the women moved quickly with their eyes down, avoiding eye contact with strangers. Most telling of all were the fresh tire tracks leading to a compound on the outskirts of town. Heavy vehicles had been through recently, probably military trucks. Sarah circled around to approach the village from the south, moving carefully through irrigation ditches and using abandoned buildings for cover. As she got closer, she could hear voices speaking in Pashto and the occasional burst of radio chatter. Hidden behind a low stone wall, Sarah used her small binoculars to observe the compound with the tire tracks. Armed men in mixed clothing, some wearing military gear, others in traditional dress, were moving in and out of the buildings. These were definitely Taliban fighters, and they were obviously searching for something, or someone. One of the fighters was talking animatedly on a radio, and Sarah managed to catch part of the conversation. They had found blood on tree branches about 5 miles south, and the tracker was confident the American woman was badly injured. The search teams were expanding their pattern to cover all possible escape routes. Sarah smiled grimly. They were following the false trail she had deliberately left when leaving the forest. A few drops of blood on strategic branches would keep them searching in the wrong direction for hours, maybe days. But her satisfaction was short-lived. Another voice on the radio was reporting that helicopters were inbound with additional search teams. Williams wasn't taking any chances. He was bringing in enough manpower to search every cave and crevice on the mountain. Sarah needed to move fast. She had maybe 6 hours before the aerial search reached this area, and she needed to be far away before that happened. But first, she wanted to learn more about the Taliban operation in this village. If she could gather intelligence about their strength and communication methods, it might help her later. She worked her way closer to the compound, using her combat training to move silently across the rocky ground. The fighters were relaxed, clearly confident that they controlled this area completely. Their weapons were modern American models, probably sold to them by Williams and his network. Through a window in the main building, Sarah could see a man in an expensive suit talking on a satellite phone. She recognized him immediately. It was one of the men from the compound raid 2 weeks earlier, one of the mysterious civilians who had been meeting with the Taliban commander. Sarah pulled out her phone and carefully took several photos through the window. The man's face was clearly visible, and she could see documents spread on the table around him. This was evidence that could help expose the entire conspiracy, but only if she could get it to the right people. As she prepared to withdraw, Sarah heard footsteps approaching her position. 2 Taliban fighters were walking directly toward her hiding spot, talking casually about their families. In seconds, they would discover her. Sarah had 2 choices: try to hide and hope they passed by, or eliminate them silently and risk alerting the entire compound. She chose a third option that required perfect timing and a lot of luck. As the first fighter rounded the corner, Sarah grabbed him from behind and pressed a pressure point on his neck that rendered him unconscious instantly. The second fighter turned at the sound, but Sarah was already moving. She swept his legs, caught him as he fell, and applied the same pressure point technique. Both men were unconscious but alive. Sarah quickly dragged them behind a storage shed and used their own equipment to tie them up. They would wake up in about an hour with headaches but no permanent damage. By then, she would be long gone. Sarah retreated from the compound and began making her way north toward the main road. According to her map, there was a government checkpoint about 10 miles away where she might be able to make contact with friendly forces. But the route would take her through several more villages, each presenting its own dangers. As she walked, Sarah thought about the man in the expensive suit. He was clearly American, probably a contractor or CIA operative who had gone rogue. The papers on his table had looked like financial documents, maybe payment records for the weapons deals. The pieces of the conspiracy were starting to come together, but Sarah still didn't understand the full scope of what she was up against. How many people were involved? How high up did the corruption go? And most importantly, who could she trust when she finally made contact with American forces? The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance reminded her that speculation was a luxury she couldn't afford. Williams' search teams were expanding their operation, and every minute she delayed increased the chances of being captured. Sarah increased her pace, moving parallel to the main road but staying hidden in the rocky terrain. The government checkpoint was still hours away, and she needed to reach it before dark. Night would bring new dangers, but it would also provide opportunities for someone with her training and determination. Behind her, the helicopters were getting closer. Sarah reached the government checkpoint just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. From her concealed position on a ridge overlooking the road, she studied the installation through her binoculars. Something was wrong. The checkpoint should have been manned by Afghan National Army soldiers, but the men she could see were wearing mixed uniforms and carrying weapons that didn't match standard military issue. More importantly, she recognized one of the vehicles parked inside the compound. It was the same type of unmarked SUV she had seen at the Taliban compound earlier. Sarah realized with growing alarm that Williams's corruption network was much larger than she had imagined. The checkpoint wasn't a safe haven, it was another trap. The government soldiers were probably more mercenaries working for the same people who wanted her dead. As she watched, a convoy of 3 black SUVs approached the checkpoint from the south. The vehicles didn't stop for inspection like normal traffic would. Instead, the guards waved them through immediately, confirming Sarah's suspicions. These weren't legitimate government forces. One of the SUVs stopped and a familiar figure got out, Captain Williams himself. Even from a distance, Sarah could see him gesturing angrily as he talked to the checkpoint commander. They were clearly discussing the failed search operation, and Williams was not happy that his teams hadn't found her body yet. Sarah activated the recording function on her phone and zoomed in as far as possible. The audio quality wouldn't be perfect, but she might be able to capture enough conversation to prove Williams was collaborating with enemy forces. "She's got to be dead," Williams was saying. "Nobody survives a fall like that without a parachute." The checkpoint commander shook his head. "My men found blood trails leading north. She made it to the forest, maybe further. The tracker says she's injured but moving. Then find her," Williams snapped. "Every hour she's alive is another hour she might contact someone. We've invested too much in this operation to let one soldier bring it down." "What about the journalist?" the commander asked. "She's been asking questions about weapons shipments. Should we eliminate her too?" Williams considered this. "Not yet. We need to make this look like Taliban activity, not a systematic elimination of witnesses. Let me talk to our contact in Kabul. He'll know how to handle the media attention." Sarah's blood ran cold. There was a journalist investigating the weapons deals, and now she was in danger too. Worse, Williams mentioned a contact in Kabul, someone high enough up to manipulate media coverage. This conspiracy reached into the highest levels of the American command structure. The conversation was interrupted by a radio transmission. One of the search teams had found the cave where Sarah had spent the night. They had discovered the journal and were reading through the evidence that AK had compiled against Williams. Williams went pale when he heard this news. "Destroy everything," he ordered. "Burn the whole cave if you have to. And find out who AK is. We need to eliminate them before they can cause more problems." Sarah had heard enough. She carefully backed away from her observation position and began planning her next move. The government checkpoint was compromised. The main roads were being watched, and Williams now knew that someone had been building a case against him. But Sarah had advantages too. She knew the truth about the conspiracy. She had evidence in the form of the journal pages and her recorded conversation. And most importantly, Williams thought she was badly injured and running scared. He wouldn't expect her to go on the offensive. Sarah consulted her map again, looking for alternative routes to Kabul. The main highways were obviously too dangerous, but there were older roads that traders and smugglers still used. These routes would take longer and be more dangerous, but they would also be less heavily monitored. One possibility was the old caravan route that ran through the Selang Pass. It would be a difficult journey on foot, especially with her injuries, but the route would take her through areas where she might find sympathetic locals who remembered her grandfather's work with the Mujahideen. Sarah's grandfather had been a CIA operative during the Soviet War, though she hadn't learned this until years later. He had worked with Afghan resistance fighters, helping them establish supply lines and safe houses. Some of those fighters were still alive, and they might remember the debt they owed to his family. As she prepared to leave the area, Sarah heard helicopter engines starting up at the checkpoint. Williams was launching another search operation, probably focused on the cave where they had found the journal. This would give her a window of opportunity to move while most of the search teams were occupied elsewhere. Sarah began jogging north along animal paths that paralleled the main road. The terrain was difficult in the darkness, but she had trained for night operations in worse conditions. Her injured ribs protested with each step, but adrenaline kept her moving at a steady pace. After 2 hours of travel, she reached a small village that wasn't marked on any of her maps. The houses were built into the mountainside itself, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. This was exactly the kind of place where old Mujahideen fighters might have settled after the war. Sarah approached the village carefully, watching for sentries or alarm systems. The people here would be suspicious of strangers, especially American soldiers. But they might also respect the old traditions of hospitality and protection for travelers. An elderly man emerged from the shadows as Sarah reached the edge of the village. He was carrying an old rifle but hadn't pointed it at her yet. He spoke in Dari, asking who she was and what she wanted. Sarah responded in the same language, using phrases her grandfather had taught her years earlier. She identified herself as the granddaughter of Khalil's friend from the mountains and asked for shelter under the ancient laws of hospitality. The old man's eyes widened when he heard her grandfather's code name. He studied her face carefully in the moonlight, then slowly lowered his rifle. "You have his eyes," he said in accented English. "And his spirit, if the stories we hear are true." "What stories?" Sarah asked. The old man smiled. "Word travels fast in these mountains. They say an American woman fell from the sky like an angel and walked away. They say she moves through the darkness like her grandfather did, helping those who fight for justice." Sarah realized that news of her survival had already spread through the traditional information networks that connected isolated villages. The local people saw her not as a fugitive, but as a continuation of her grandfather's legacy. "The corrupt ones are hunting you," the old man continued, "but they do not understand these mountains like we do. Come, my daughter. We will hide you until you are ready to strike back." The village welcomed Sarah with a warmth that surprised her. These people had every reason to be suspicious of American soldiers, but they remembered her grandfather's sacrifice and were willing to help his granddaughter. They gave her food, tended to her wounds, and most importantly, they gave her information. The village elder, whose name was Haji Abdullah, had been tracking Williams' operation for months. His own son had been killed by weapons that Williams had sold to the Taliban, and he wanted justice. He had been working with the mysterious AK to gather evidence, serving as her local contact and safe house coordinator. "AK is alive," Haji Abdullah told Sarah, "but she is trapped in Kabul. Williams' people discovered her identity 2 days ago. She is hiding, but they will find her soon unless someone can help." Sarah learned that AK was Dr. Amanda Kane, a forensic accountant who had been sent to Afghanistan to investigate financial irregularities in military contracts. She had discovered the weapons smuggling operation and had been building a case when Williams realized she was getting too close to the truth. "Dr. Kane has evidence that could destroy the entire network," Haji Abdullah explained. "Bank records, communication intercepts, witness testimony, but she needs someone to help her get the information to honest authorities in Washington." Sarah now understood why she had been framed. Williams hadn't just been trying to eliminate a witness. He had been trying to eliminate someone who could help Dr. Kane expose the conspiracy. Her survival skills and military training made her the perfect person to reach Kabul and extract the accountant. "I'll help her," Sarah said, "but I need to get to Kabul without being detected." Haji Abdullah smiled. "That can be arranged. We have our own networks older than any government. You will travel as a member of our trading caravan. The corrupt soldiers look for a desperate fugitive, not a confident merchant woman traveling with legitimate business." Sarah spent the next day resting and preparing for the journey. The village women taught her how to move and speak like a local trader, while the men showed her the best routes to avoid military patrols. By evening, she felt ready to take on the most dangerous part of her mission. As the sun set over the mountains, Sarah said goodbye to her temporary family and joined a small caravan heading toward Kabul. She was no longer running from her enemies. She was hunting them. The trading caravan moved through the night like a ghost convoy, following ancient routes that existed long before modern borders or military checkpoints. Sarah rode in the back of a truck loaded with carpets and spices, her face covered and her rifle hidden beneath traditional trade goods. The caravan consisted of 6 vehicles driven by men who had been smuggling goods across these mountains for generations. They knew every patrol schedule, every checkpoint commander who could be bribed, and every hiding place where a convoy could disappear if necessary. As they traveled, Sarah learned more about Dr. Amanda Kane's situation from the caravan leader, a weathered man named Asif who spoke excellent English. Dr. Kane was hiding in the basement of an old bookstore in Kabul's University District, but William's mercenaries were systematically searching every building in the area. She has maybe 2 days before they find her, Asif explained. The bookstore owner is brave, but he cannot hide her forever. Too many people are asking questions about strange noises in the basement. Sarah studied a detailed map of Kabul that Asif provided. The University District was in the heart of the city, surrounded by government buildings and military installations. Getting Dr. Kane out would require careful planning and perfect timing. What about extraction options? Sarah asked. How do we get her out of the country once we reach her? Asif smiled mysteriously. My cousin works at the airport. He can arrange special cargo manifests for the right price. But first we must reach the city alive. The caravan was stopped 3 times during the night journey, but each checkpoint waved them through after brief conversations with the guards. Sarah realized that these traders had been paying protection money to multiple factions for years, buying safe passage from everyone who controlled territory along their routes. At the 3rd checkpoint, Sarah recognized one of the guards. He was one of William's mercenaries. Her heart pounded as the man walked directly toward her truck, but she forced herself to remain calm and keep her face covered. The mercenary glanced into the cargo area where she was hiding, but saw only what appeared to be a local woman sleeping among the trade goods. Any problems tonight? The mercenary asked Asif in broken Dari. No problems, friend, Asif replied smoothly. Just carpets and spices for the Kabul markets. Same route we always take. The mercenary seemed satisfied and waved the convoy through. As they drove away, Sarah realized how close she had come to capture. William's people were everywhere, but they were looking for a desperate American soldier, not a covered Afghan traitor. They reached the outskirts of Kabul just before dawn. The city was waking up to another day of tension and uncertainty, with military patrols moving through the streets and helicopters circling overhead. Sarah could see that the security situation had deteriorated even more since her last visit to the capital. Asif drove his truck through narrow back streets that avoided the main military checkpoints. He seemed to know every alley and shortcut in the city, navigating with the confidence of someone who had been running contraband through Kabul for decades. The bookstore is in the old quarter, Asif explained as they approached the University District. Very dangerous area now. William's men are searching building by building, asking about foreign women. The owner sent word this morning. They will find Dr. Kane today if we do not reach her first. Sarah studied the neighborhood through the truck's rear window. The streets were busy with normal daytime activity, but she could spot the surveillance teams positioned at key intersections. Williams had deployed enough personnel to watch every route in and out of the area. We need a distraction, Sarah said. Something to draw their attention away from the bookstore long enough for us to extract Dr. Kane. Asif nodded thoughtfully. My nephew works at the university. He can arrange a student demonstration in the main square. Very loud, very chaotic. The security forces will have to respond. How long can they keep it going? Maybe 1 hour before the authorities disperse them, but it will be enough if we move quickly. Sarah spent the next hour preparing for the extraction. She changed back into her military gear, knowing that she might need all her combat equipment if things went wrong. Asif provided her with a motorcycle for quick movement through the narrow streets, while his nephew organized the distraction. At exactly noon, the sound of chanting voices erupted from the university square. Hundreds of students had gathered to protest corruption in the government, their voices echoing off the surrounding buildings. Within minutes, military vehicles were racing toward the disturbance from all directions. Sarah watched through binoculars as Williams's surveillance teams abandoned their positions to respond to the demonstration. This was her window of opportunity. She started the motorcycle and raced through the back streets toward the bookstore. The shop was an ancient building squeezed between a tea house and a tailor's workshop. Sarah parked the motorcycle in an alley behind the store and approached through the rear entrance. The door was locked, but she had learned lock-picking skills during her special operations training. The interior of the bookstore was dark and cramped, with shelves reaching from floor to ceiling filled with texts in multiple languages. The owner, an elderly man with thick glasses, emerged from behind the counter when he heard her enter. "You are Khalil's granddaughter," he said in English. It wasn't a question. "Dr. Kane is waiting for you." He led Sarah through a maze of book stacks to a hidden door behind a false bookshelf. The door opened onto stairs leading down to a basement that had been converted into a small apartment. Dr. Amanda Kane was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, and Sarah immediately understood why William's people were so desperate to eliminate her. Dr. Kane was a serious woman in her 40s with the focused intensity of someone who spent her life following financial trails. But more importantly, she was carrying a briefcase that obviously contained evidence valuable enough to justify a massive conspiracy to silence her. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming," Dr. Kane said. "I can hear them searching the buildings on this street. They'll be here within the hour." "Then we leave now," Sarah replied. "What's in the briefcase?" Dr. Kane opened the case to reveal dozens of financial documents, computer hard drives, and photographs. Everything you need to prove that Williams has been selling American weapons to Taliban commanders for over 2 years. Bank records showing payments totaling $15 million. Communication intercepts proving coordination with enemy forces. And most importantly, evidence that 3 other officers and 2 CIA operatives are part of the conspiracy. Sarah felt her anger growing as she looked at the evidence. Williams hadn't just betrayed her. He had betrayed every American soldier serving in Afghanistan. His greed had put weapons in the hands of people who used them to kill his own countrymen. "There's more," Dr. Kane continued. "The conspiracy reaches all the way to Washington. A defense contractor called Titan Security has been facilitating the weapons sales and splitting the profits with military personnel. They have contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're using their political connections to cover up the illegal activities." The sound of vehicles pulling up outside interrupted their conversation. Through the basement window, Sarah could see military boots marching past at street level. William's people had arrived at the bookstore. "Back exit?" Sarah asked the bookstore owner. "Sealed last week for repairs," he replied nervously. "The only way out is through the shop." Sarah heard heavy footsteps on the floor above them, followed by voices demanding to search the premises. They had maybe 2 minutes before the hidden door was discovered. Sarah looked around the basement for anything that could help them escape. In the corner, she noticed an old ventilation grate that led to the building's air circulation system. It was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, but it might connect to the neighboring buildings. "Can you fit through there?" Sarah asked Dr. Kane. The accountant looked at the narrow opening and nodded grimly. "I've been crawling through tight spaces to avoid Williams's people for 3 days. 1 more won't kill me." Sarah helped Dr. Kane climb into the ventilation shaft, then handed her the briefcase. "Follow the ductwork toward the tea house next door. Wait for me there." As Dr. Kane disappeared into the darkness of the ventilation system, Sarah turned to face the bookstore owner. "When they come down here, tell them you heard noises but found nothing. Act confused and frightened." "What about you?" the old man asked. Sarah smiled grimly and checked her weapons. "I'm going to give them something else to worry about." The basement door burst open just as Sarah positioned herself behind a support pillar. 3 armed men in tactical gear rushed down the stairs, their weapons raised and ready. But they were looking for a hiding accountant, not an armed ranger prepared for combat. Sarah's first shot took down the lead man before he could react. The second mercenary spun toward her position, but she was already moving, using the basement's support columns for cover. Her second shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the floor. The third man was smarter. He immediately retreated back up the stairs, shouting for reinforcements. Sarah knew she had maybe 30 seconds before the building was surrounded. She ran to the ventilation grate and squeezed through the opening, following Dr. Kane's path toward the neighboring building. The ductwork was even tighter than it had appeared, and Sarah's injured ribs protested with every movement. But she could hear boots thundering through the bookstore above her, and that motivated her to ignore the pain and keep crawling. She emerged from a grate in the tea house's kitchen, startling the cook who was preparing lunch. Dr. Kane was waiting in the dining area, clutching her briefcase and looking pale but determined. "Now what?" Dr. Kane asked as the sound of shouting voices came from the bookstore next door. Sarah looked out the front window and saw military vehicles blocking both ends of the street. William's people had learned from their mistakes and were now surrounding entire city blocks instead of just searching individual buildings. "Now we go up," Sarah said, pointing toward the staircase that led to the tea house's upper floors. And hope that Asif's extraction plan works as well as his smuggling routes. Sarah and Dr. Kane climbed to the tea house's rooftop, where they found themselves looking out over a maze of connected buildings in the old quarter of Kabul. The traditional architecture meant that most structures shared walls and rooftops, creating a network of pathways that existed above the street-level surveillance. "Can you handle rooftop travel?" Sarah asked Dr. Kane, noting that the accountant was breathing heavily from the climb. "I'll manage," Dr. Kane replied, gripping her briefcase tighter. "Just don't ask me to jump any wide gaps." Sarah studied the rooftop landscape, plotting a route that would take them away from the immediate search area. About 6 buildings away, she could see a larger structure that looked like it might be an apartment complex with better access to different streets. They began moving across the interconnected rooftops, staying low to avoid being spotted by the helicopters that were now circling the neighborhood. The surfaces were uneven and sometimes treacherous, with loose tiles and unexpected gaps between buildings, but Sarah's training helped her navigate the obstacles while assisting Dr. Kane. As they reached the 3rd building, Sarah heard her satellite phone buzzing. Only one person had this number, Haji Abdullah from the mountain village. She answered quickly, keeping her voice low. "Granddaughter?" The old man's voice crackled through the poor connection. "The corrupt captain has discovered our village. He knows we helped you. My people are scattered to the hills, but he captured my grandson. They are using him to force information about your plans." Sarah felt a surge of anger and guilt. Her actions had brought danger to innocent people who had only tried to help her. "Is your grandson safe?" "For now. But Williams demands to know where you are and who you are working with. My grandson is brave, but they have ways of making people talk." "Tell me where they're holding him," Sarah said. "No, daughter. Your mission is more important than one old man's family. Expose the corruption. Bring justice. That is what my grandson would want." The connection ended, leaving Sarah staring at the phone. Dr. Kane had overheard enough to understand what was happening. "We can't save everyone," Dr. Kane said gently, "but we can make sure Williams and his people pay for what they've done to all of us." Sarah knew the accountant was right, but it didn't make her feel any better about the situation. Every minute she delayed gave Williams more time to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. But every minute also brought more innocent people into danger. They reached the apartment building and found a fire escape that led down to a side street. From their elevated position, Sarah could see that Williams's search teams were expanding their operation throughout the entire university district. Military vehicles were positioned at every major intersection, and foot patrols were moving systematically through the neighborhoods. "We need to get to the airport," Sarah said, "but they'll be watching all the main routes." Dr. Kane pulled out her own phone and showed Sarah a text message. "I've been in contact with someone at the U.S. Embassy. Deputy Director Harrison from the State Department. He's clean. I verified his background thoroughly before making contact. He can get us diplomatic protection if we can reach the embassy compound." "How far is the embassy from here?" "About 4 miles. But it's in the most heavily secured part of the city. Williams' people will definitely have it under surveillance." Sarah considered their options. The embassy would provide safety, but it would also trap them in a diplomatic bubble where Williams' allies in the government could pressure them to stay quiet. The airport offered escape, but it would be heavily monitored too. "There's a third option," Sarah said. "What if we don't run at all? What if we force Williams to come to us on our terms?" Dr. Kane looked puzzled. "How do we do that?" Sarah pulled out the journal pages she had taken from the mountain cave. "We release everything. All the evidence, all the accusations, everything. We make it public before Williams can stop us, but how? The local media is controlled by the government, and Williams has people monitoring internet communications." Sarah smiled for the first time in days. "I know someone who can help with that." She dialed another number on her satellite phone, hoping the connection would work. After several rings, a familiar voice answered. "Sarah, is that really you?" "Everyone thinks you're dead." It was Sergeant Maria Santos, Sarah's former roommate from Ranger training and now a communications specialist stationed in Germany. More importantly, Maria had connections with military journalists who specialized in exposing corruption. "Maria, I need a huge favor, and I need it fast," Sarah said. "I'm going to send you a massive file of evidence about weapons smuggling and corruption. I need you to get it to every honest journalist you know immediately." "Sarah, what the hell is going on?" There are official reports saying you were killed in a helicopter crash, but I'm also hearing rumors that you've gone rogue. The official reports are lies. I was thrown out of a helicopter by corrupt officers who are selling weapons to the Taliban. I have proof, but I need to get it published before they kill me and destroy the evidence. There was a long pause as Maria processed this information. Send me everything. I'll make sure it gets to the right people. But Sarah, be careful who you trust. If this conspiracy is as big as you say, they might have people monitoring military communications too. Sarah quickly photographed all the documents in Dr. Kane's briefcase and transmitted them through her encrypted satellite connection. The process took nearly 20 minutes, during which they could hear search teams getting closer to their building. It's done, Maria's voice came back through the phone. I'm sending copies to investigative reporters at 3 different news organizations right now. This should be public within hours. As Sarah ended the call, Dr. Kane grabbed her arm. Look, she said, pointing toward the street below. A convoy of black SUVs was pulling up in front of their building. Captain Williams himself got out of the lead vehicle, along with a dozen heavily armed mercenaries. He was no longer trying to hide his involvement. This was an open operation to eliminate the last witnesses to his crimes. They found us faster than I expected, Sarah said. We need to move now. But as they prepared to leave the rooftop, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching from multiple directions. Williams had called in air support, and the building was being surrounded from above and below. There's nowhere to run, Dr. Kane said, her voice tight with fear. Sarah checked her weapons and ammunition. She had enough for one last fight, but not enough to hold off an entire assault team. Unless... Dr. Kane, how important is it that you personally survived to testify about this evidence? The accountant understood immediately what Sarah was asking. The documents speak for themselves. My testimony would be helpful, but it's not essential if the evidence is already public. Good, because I have an idea that might save one of us, but it's going to be very dangerous for both of us. Sarah explained her plan quickly. Dr. Kane would hide in the building's water tank on the roof, which would provide some protection from small arms fire. Sarah would make herself visible to draw Williams's attention and lead his forces away from the building. Once they're chasing me, you wait 30 minutes and then make your way to the embassy, Sarah said. Tell Deputy Director Harrison everything and make sure he knows the evidence is already being published. What about you? Dr. Kane asked. Sarah smiled grimly. I'm going to remind Williams why you don't mess with a ranger who knows how to survive. The sound of boots in the stairwell told them that Williams' men had entered the building. Sarah helped Dr. Kane climb into the water tank, then positioned herself at the rooftop access door with her rifle ready. When the first mercenary's head appeared in the doorway, Sarah put a bullet right next to it, close enough to send concrete chips flying but not close enough to kill. She wanted them cautious, not dead. Her goal was to escape, not to start a war in the middle of Kabul. She's on the roof, someone shouted from below. Bring up the heavy weapons. Sarah fired 2 more shots down the stairwell, then sprinted across the rooftop toward the adjacent building. Behind her, she could hear Williams's voice on a radio coordinating the assault from the street below. Don't kill her, Williams was shouting. We need to know who else she's working with. Sarah smiled as she leaped across the gap between buildings. Williams still didn't understand that the evidence was already beyond his reach. He was fighting a battle that he had already lost, but his desperation would make him more dangerous, not less. As she landed hard on the next rooftop, Sarah heard the distinctive whine of incoming helicopter gunships. Williams was escalating the situation far beyond what was reasonable for capturing one person. His panic was showing, and that gave Sarah hope. The evidence was public. Dr. Kane was hidden. Now Sarah just had to survive long enough for the truth to matter. Sarah raced across the rooftops as helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures. Behind her, Williams's mercenaries were following her path, but their heavier equipment and unfamiliarity with rooftop movement slowed them down. Sarah had trained for urban warfare in environments exactly like this. She reached the edge of the old quarter where the traditional buildings gave way to modern construction. The gap between the last old building and the first new one was too wide to jump. But Sarah had noticed something during her earlier reconnaissance that might work. A construction crane was positioned next to the new building, its arm extending over the gap. The crane's cable hung down within reach, but using it would require perfect timing and a lot of faith in her upper body strength. Sarah clipped her rifle to her gear and grabbed the cable just as the first helicopter gunship came around the corner of the building. The pilot saw her immediately and began maneuvering for a clear shot. But Sarah was already swinging across the gap. She released the cable at the peak of her swing and crashed through a window of the modern office building. Glass exploded around her as she rolled across an empty conference room, coming to rest against the far wall. Her injured ribs protested violently, but she forced herself to keep moving. The office building was filled with confused civilian workers who screamed and ran for the exits when they saw an armed woman covered in blood and glass. Sarah tried to avoid them as much as possible, but she needed to reach the building's stairwell before Williams's people surrounded the structure. Her satellite phone rang as she reached the emergency stairs. It was Maria calling from Germany. "Sarah, the story is live." Maria's excited voice came through the speaker. "3 major news networks are running it simultaneously. The evidence you sent is all over the internet. Williams and his entire network are finished." Sarah felt a moment of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the sound of boots thundering up the stairwell below her. "That's great, Maria. But Williams doesn't seem to have gotten the message yet. He's still trying to kill me." "That's because there's more news. The Pentagon has issued arrest warrants for Williams and 6 other officers. Military police units are moving to arrest them right now. He's not trying to cover up the conspiracy anymore. He's trying to escape before they catch him." This changed everything. Williams was no longer operating as part of a secret conspiracy. He was now a fugitive who knew his only chance of avoiding prison was to eliminate the witnesses and flee the country. That made him more dangerous than ever. Sarah reached the building's roof access and pushed through the door. The helicopter was still circling, but now she could see other aircraft approaching from different directions. Some of them had U.S. military markings. The legitimate authorities were finally responding to the crisis. Her phone rang again, but this time it was an unknown number. Sarah almost ignored it, but something made her answer. "Sergeant Martinez?" The voice was crisp and professional. "This is Deputy Director Harrison from the State Department. Dr. Kane contacted us from her hiding place. We have teams moving to extract both of you, but I need you to get to a secure location where we can reach you safely." "Where?" Sarah asked, watching as Williams' mercenaries emerged onto rooftops throughout the area. They were closing in from multiple directions. "There's a U.S. military helicopter landing on the roof of the Kabul Central Hospital in 10 minutes. Can you reach that location?" Sarah looked across the cityscape toward the hospital. It was about 8 blocks away, but the route would take her through areas controlled by Williams' people. Still, it was her best chance. "I'll be there," she said. Sarah began moving across the modern building's rooftop, but this time she wasn't just running from pursuit. She was running toward rescue. The knowledge that legitimate authorities were finally involved gave her new energy, despite her injuries. The hospital was a large, modern facility that stood out among the surrounding buildings. Sarah could already see a military helicopter approaching from the east, its markings clearly visible as official U.S. forces. But she could also see that Williams's mercenaries had spotted the same helicopter. A gunfight erupted in the streets below as Williams' people tried to intercept the rescue operation. Military police units that had been sent to arrest Williams were now engaged in combat with his mercenaries throughout the university district. The corruption investigation had turned into an urban battle. Sarah reached the edge of her current building and realized she would have to descend to street level to cover the remaining distance to the hospital. The rooftop route was blocked by a construction site that couldn't be crossed safely. She found a fire escape and began climbing down, but halfway to the ground, she heard someone calling her name. Looking up, she saw Captain Williams himself standing on the rooftop she had just left, pointing a rifle in her direction. "It's over, Martinez," Williams shouted. "You've destroyed everything. Years of work, millions of dollars, all ruined because you couldn't mind your own business." Sarah continued descending, using the fire escape's metal framework for cover. Williams fired several shots, but his angle was poor, and the bullets sparked off the metal around her. "You never understood what we were doing," Williams continued, his voice cracking with desperation. "We were making peace. Selling weapons to both sides keeps the conflict balanced. It prevents any one faction from becoming too powerful." Sarah reached the alley behind the building and began running toward the hospital. Williams's rationalization was pathetic. He had sold weapons to people who killed American soldiers, and no amount of political justification could excuse that. The hospital was now only 3 blocks away, and Sarah could see the rescue helicopter hovering over the roof. But she could also see mercenaries moving to intercept her route. Williams was using his radio to coordinate one final attempt to stop her from reaching safety. Sarah ducked into a narrow alley as bullets began hitting the walls around her. 2 mercenaries had positioned themselves at the far end of the alley, blocking her path to the hospital. She was trapped between them and Williams' forces behind her. But Sarah Martinez had not survived a fall from a helicopter, crossed hostile mountains, and exposed a massive conspiracy just to be cornered in an alley. She pulled out her last grenade and made a decision that would either save her life or end it. She threw the grenade toward the mercenaries at the end of the alley, but instead of taking cover, she ran directly toward the explosion. The blast created a cloud of dust and debris that provided perfect concealment for her desperate charge. Sarah burst through the smoke cloud and found both mercenaries down, but not dead. She didn't stop to check their condition, she just kept running toward the hospital as fast as her injured body could carry her. The rescue helicopter was already beginning its descent as Sarah reached the hospital's main entrance. She could see soldiers in legitimate U.S. military uniforms securing the landing zone on the roof. After days of running from corrupt forces, the sight of honest American soldiers was almost overwhelming. Sarah took the hospital's stairs 3 at a time, her lungs burning and her ribs screaming in protest. Behind her, she could hear Williams and his remaining mercenaries pursuing her through the building, but they were too late. She burst through the roof access door just as the helicopter touched down. The pilot was a young woman who looked like she had stepped straight out of a recruitment poster, and the soldier who helped Sarah into the aircraft wore the insignia of the military police. "Sergeant Martinez?" the MP shouted over the rotor noise. "You're under protective custody pending a full investigation." "Are you injured?" "Nothing that won't heal," Sarah replied, collapsing into one of the aircraft's seats. "But there are innocent people who helped me who are still in danger. Williams captured an old man's grandson in the mountains. We need to find him." "Already taken care of," the MP said with a smile. "Based on your evidence, we've been rolling up Williams' entire network for the past 2 hours. The boy was rescued and the village is under military protection." As the helicopter lifted off from the hospital roof, Sarah looked down and saw Williams standing in the doorway to the roof access. He was shouting something she couldn't hear, his face twisted with rage and defeat. Military police were already moving up the stairs behind him. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in a clean hospital bed at Bagram Air Base, her injuries properly treated and her story officially recorded. Dr. Kane was in the next room, giving detailed testimony about the financial evidence she had uncovered. Williams and 12 other conspirators were in military custody, facing charges that would put them in prison for the rest of their lives.